Sometimes when I am working with the scripture and trying to figure out what is behind the text itself, where did it come from, what was going on when it not only was originally written, but what was going on even before it comes to be written, when it was in the actual time period in which the events that are described. What was going on then? It's always important to keep things in their historical context, perhaps in their geographical context also. But since we can't, sometimes I can't even remember what I did just a few minutes ago, let alone last week. How is it possible to go that far back into time and history, and you end up guessing what was in their minds? What were they thinking when they did this? Because it's not always obvious, right? Sometimes it's pretty darn obvious what they were thinking in terms of the outcomes and implications. But for the most part, for the biblical people, it's much more difficult. What were they thinking? So I'd like to imagine, and sometimes that's what you have to do in working with the scripture, kind of imagine or just kind of create a scene. It's not imposing it on the scripture or being false about the original text, but it's just adding in the gaps, if you will. And sometimes adding in the gaps makes it more creative in some way. So I'd like to imagine this scene. Jesus is doing his preaching and teaching in Galilee, and all of a sudden one day he turns to his disciples and he says, "Let's go to Jerusalem." And they all look at one another and like, well, where does that come from? Why does he want to go to Jerusalem? Nothing good happens down in Jerusalem. Because you have to remember, the people up in Galilee really had a negative view of Jerusalem. It's sort of like what many of us have in terms of the view of Washington, D.C. We don't always have a very positive view of what goes on here. Well, the people in Galilee had a very negative view of what was going on in Jerusalem. It was the temple. It was the seat of Jewish power in terms of the king, King Herod. It was also the Roman center. So there was not anything good that the people up in the north wanted to have to do with the people in the south. And when Jesus says, "Let's go to Jerusalem," the text sometimes even comes, well, don't you remember, they're just trying to kill you already. Why do you want to go someplace where they're trying to kill you? Don't you know that might happen to you when you get there? And Jesus, again, we can't read his mind, but it must have been like, nope, we're going to Jerusalem. And so this journey begins from Galilee going to Jerusalem. And along the way, as we've already seen, he begins to preach and teach to them about what this journey to Jerusalem ultimately means. So having that kind of context for these scriptures that we're reading as we go along here in the season of Lent, to also think of it this way. And remember, there's not just the layers in Scripture, the layers that allow us to enter at different points in different places, but put these Scriptures now in the context of our worship, in the context of our liturgy. We add another layer onto it, so that we're not just looking at the Scriptures, we're looking at how this lectionary that we use on Sundays, how this lectionary wants us to consider these scriptures, or wants us to look at them in a way that has to do with worship and liturgy. Remember, I said that this whole season of Lent was ultimately for those preparing for baptism. So the scriptures are not just to tell us about this journey of Jesus to Jerusalem, but it's also to invite our reflection on the journey that we're on. Those who were preparing for baptism, what that was going to mean for them as they approached baptism. But what does it mean for us, the baptized? What is this journey that we're on? Obviously not to the literal, geographical, historical Jerusalem, but what is this journey that we're on, as we heard last week in the proclamation of Jesus? What is this journey that we're on into the reign of God? What is that? So not only do we have the layer of the Scripture, now we have a spiritual layer or a liturgical layer to consider in interpreting the text that we use each Sunday. So if you remember, back there on the Transfiguration Sunday 2 weeks ago, that we went up on the mountain, and we heard from the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that he had been to the mountaintop, and as he looked over, and the image that's behind that part of his text, of his speech, was Moses going up onto the top of Mount Nebo as they come out of slavery in Egypt, and now are just on the verge, ready to cross the Jordan River. There was always the demarcation line between the east and the desert and pagan land, and now the entry into the promised land. And so Moses stands on the mountain and looks over into the promised land. And as the story in Exodus tells us, Moses doesn't make it. God was not happy with Moses striking the rock a couple of times, and so Moses doesn't make it. But in any event, Moses stands on the mountain and looks down into the land of promise. A promise that had begun way, way, way back there in the story of Abraham and Sarah. I'm going to promise you that you will be a great nation. Now imagine, in the ears of the Israelites, as they're getting ready to cross into the promised land, they're echoing those words. You're going to be a great nation when you get there. So Moses looks over into the promised land, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, using that metaphor, that image, looks into the future to where the circumstances of slavery and oppression, of racism and segregation and all of that existed in that day, in the 1960s, what it would look like in the future if those things didn't exist. What is it going to look like for the Israelites once they have moved totally out of slavery and oppression into a place of freedom? What is that going to look like? And so as the next Sunday in the Gospel, the invitation was to consider the reign of God. Well, I likened and I connected that this vision of the future that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had, and the vision of being on the top of the mountain and seeing what the reign of God looks like, is an important connection for us to make. So the goal is the reign of God. The goal in Jesus' story is Jerusalem. Well, if you go all the way to the end of the book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, it says that in this place, the reign of God, that it will look like a certain way. And it will look like this. There will be no more tears. There will be no more suffering. There will be no more death. There will only be life. And so the end journey for all of us, and the great end journey, is the heavenly Jerusalem. Or for Jesus, Jerusalem in his day. Or for Moses and the Israelites, the promised land. There's a goal. That this journey isn't just let's go out for a Sunday walk, but we got a destination. And the destination, again, is not just a literal destination, the historical Jerusalem, but is a spiritual destination. Is this heavenly Jerusalem, and the vision that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had standing on the mountain, where black children and white children could play together, where there's not going to be any division between Catholics and Jews and Protestants, where there's a world where inclusion and equality and acceptance and joy and peace, where that's the world that is going to be there. Again, not just in the future, or not just in the heavenly Jerusalem, but the invitation is, well, that's what's possible now. Well, how is it possible now? Because the reign of God is here. It's not yet to come. It's here. Jesus proclaimed it. The reign of God is here. And so the invitation of that day was also, if it's here, and we look around us and we go, wow, it doesn't really look like it, right? There's lots going on. And so the invitation was, well, then to reach that goal, to understand what this journey that we're making is all about, is that you're going to have to change. That's the metanoia. That you're going to have to turn yourselves around in such a way that the orientation of your life is indeed towards that future, towards that heavenly Jerusalem, towards the actual physical place of Jerusalem, that we have to turn ourselves from our own own ways of doing things and thinking about things and trying to achieve and accomplish things, to now turn ourselves towards the direction, towards the goal that God has in store, that God has in mind. And we all think we're doing that. But obviously, if the world that we live in isn't being transformed, then are we really committed to that vision? Or are we locked in place thinking that the status quo is it, and that's it, and there's nothing we can do about it? So here's something to consider. That when Jesus turns to his disciples and says, let's go to Jerusalem, again, he's not, and 2,000 years of Christian theology has placed on this whole thing perhaps another interpretation that I don't want to take the time to explain or try to explain ourselves out of. But when he says, let's go to Jerusalem, consider this. He knows not only what Jerusalem represents for the Jewish people, but he knows what the present situation of Jerusalem is. That Herod's in control. And the only reason why Herod's in control is because the Romans have put Herod in control. And so behind Herod Antipas, that's who's ruling at the time that we're looking at, is Roman power and Roman authority. If you've ever seen any models of Jerusalem, right at the precinct of the temple, at the corner of the temple, is this huge fortress that comes to be called Antonio Fortress. And the only reason why this fortress is built at the corner of the temple precinct is because it housed the Roman soldiers that were intending to keep the peace in the temple precinct and in Jerusalem. It's a huge building. It stood out higher than the temple itself. So that if you looked at Jerusalem from wherever you were, you could see the top of the Antonio Fortress. It could only represent one thing. It didn't represent God. It represented the authority and power of the Romans, who had now put Herod in, and that you better respect Herod, because if you don't respect Herod, then the Romans are always going to come and, well, God knows what they're going to do to you, but you know what they're going to do to you, right? So in a sense, when Jesus turns around and says, let's go to Jerusalem, I like to think of it this way. It's sort of like the students who just last week marched to Washington, D.C. to say, hey, enough is enough. Enough is enough. We're dying. And you don't seem to think too much about that, because you seem to be only interested in your own things. So I'd like to think that as the students walk to D.C. or the capital of Florida, or wherever they might have gone, or wherever they're going to walk over the next few months, that it's like Jesus going to Jerusalem to speak truth to power. To speak truth to power. You see, because the authorities in Jerusalem have decided for the people what truth is. And what the authorities in Jerusalem, and by extension Rome, have decided for the people is that you are to live in a certain way, obedient to the laws of Rome and to the rules of the Torah, in such a way that you basically have no sense of who you are. And so they keep thinking that they're defining our lives for us. It's sort of like, how many generations, up until just this recently, that women were silent in the face of all the men who thought that they could define all your women's lives. And get away with a lot of abuse and harassment. And now we have begun to see, just like the suffragettes in the 1920s who said, we're citizens, don't we have a right to vote? Now perhaps the Me Too movement is saying, we're women and we're not going to let you do this to us anymore. That's truth to power. So that in this movement towards Jerusalem, that it's going to take a certain, it takes a certain effort on our part to be ready that when we get to Jerusalem, that we're on track with the program of what the reign of God is about. Because it's going to depend upon us to establish another way of thinking and talking and acting and being in the world. That's the idea. So that when Jesus gets to Jerusalem, and in our Christian tradition, suffers and dies in Jerusalem, we have to be able to understand what the meaning of all of that was. And it's not just a meaning in spiritual terms that we're saved from our sin, but the meaning of it is that in the way that Jesus spoke truth to power, and we'll see it next week in the gospel, that when he did that, it was intended not for himself, but for us. Well, the truth was that the way that Jerusalem and the Romans had defined reality was not the true reality, but rather the reign of God was the true reality. That vision that Martin Luther King Jr. gave us on the mountain, vision of inclusion, not exclusion. So that, you see, one of the first things that we have to do as we make this journey is, as the scripture says today, take up the cross and follow me. Well, unfortunately, that has had a negative implication. And I say this with all truthfulness and honesty. There have probably been women in abusive relationships, terribly hurtful relationships, where it has often been said to women, well, that's the cross you bear, just bear it. And I say, BS. That's not the idea. The idea isn't that we simply are silent in the face of suffering and violence being done to our person because it somehow will make us better Christians or enable us to identify ourselves better with Jesus. BS. That's not what that is. Let me be clear, no one should ever feel compelled to accept abuse or violence done against their person. No one has to stand for that or be silent in the face of it. So what does this mean, to take up the cross? It means to identify with Jesus and his cause. So what's the first thing that we have to die to in ourselves? That it's not our cause, but it's Jesus' cause. We have to stop thinking that the world is about us. I say this in all, how can I say this? Steve keeps saying to me sometimes, it's not all about you. And I say, well, I'm an only child. Of course it's all about me. It's not about us. In other words, when I say it's not about us, what I mean is that if the world serves us, then indeed how we define ourselves is the way that the world wants to define ourselves, by the accumulation of honor and prestige, by the accumulation of wealth and goods. The world keeps telling us that this will make you successful and happy, that this is what your true purpose in the world is to have positions of domination and power over others. Men have been told that for generations, that it is our divine right that we stand in power and authority over women, and that you are to be subservient and obedient to us. We've been told that all of these generations, and that all of a sudden when women say no to us, we don't know how to take that as men. Because we have always thought that our identity depends upon everybody saying yes to us. And women, in the same way, have been told by society that you have a certain position and place to keep and to hold, and that's it. You better be silent and accept that. The world has told us this. So what we have to die to in this first stage of this journey toward Jerusalem is we have to die to what the world has told us we should be. Because none of that is reflective of the image of God that is in us. None of that is. Every time that we think that we're going to solve violence by buying another gun, we've bought into what the world thinks instead of what the reign of God believes. Every time that we think that teachers should be armed with guns instead of better books and more pencils and more classroom supplies, then we bought into what the world thinks. So that's the first thing, that we have to die to how the world defines us. And I think this is really, as a man, this is really more for us, because we keep thinking that we have to be in charge of everything, bully anybody, and everybody better pay attention to us, and we're always right, and everybody else is always wrong. We have to die to that man. That our humanity, our masculinity doesn't depend upon that at all. And so the second thing that we have to do is understand that if it means dying to how the world defines us, it means that inside of us, because this is the spirituality inside. In the first half of our life, our spirituality depends upon power and the accumulation of wealth, whatever that may mean, physically, literally, spiritually. That in the first half of life, we build ourselves up to thinking about career and jobs and children and house and all of that, 401ks, whatever it may be. But in the second half of life, we realize how pointless and fruitless that is, because our children aren't going to want all of our trinkets when we die. But that's what's defined the first half of our life, whatever the trinkets might be. And so many of you already have come to know that when you downsize, basically what you're doing is saying, this old identity, this old self no longer is helpful to me, that I have to change now into an identity in self that I'm not always confident and sure about, because boy, change is difficult. And so the vision that we have to move from to is where it says that the vision is exclusion and domination and control is what makes you a human being. 2, what makes you a human being is your willingness to be inclusive, to be accepting, to see even those who might want to harm you as your neighbor. So that this vision, you see what happens on this journey to Jerusalem is we have to die to what the world has told us and what we've created in that world, to something new that isn't always clear to us and we're not always confident about. But in doing so, then as we progress towards Jerusalem, that we're less encumbered by our fears and our anxieties and by the need to constantly keep the barriers of prejudice and discrimination up to protect ourselves. The world keeps telling us Muslims are to be feared. They're terrorists. Mexicans are rapists. You see how the world sounds in terms of human beings? But we say, no, they're human beings, to be loved, to be respected, to be honored. Yes, they make bad choices, so do we. But they're still humans in the image and likeness of God. So that's what we have to do in order to grasp what the spirituality that we need for us today is. We have to let go of the old in order to be able to embrace the new. And as we continue the journey towards Jerusalem, keep that in mind, what the vision is, what the goal is. It's not just Jerusalem. It's a world that is built upon inclusion and respect and acceptance, where there are no people at the edges and at the margins, where there isn't suffering, that is created by our choices and decisions, but that we can embrace the image of God and give testimony to who God is.